all you literary legends and luminaries. I'm Julie and welcome to this week's episode of Booksmart. Today I'll be talking about Ask Not, The Kennedys and the Woman They Destroyed by Maureen Callahan. Just when you think you already know all the scandalous behavior of the Kennedys, a book like this comes along. In case you're new to Booksmart, I've read a ton of books about Marilyn Monroe, like way too many to count. I've also read several books on the Kennedys and Jackie Kennedy as well. My initial interest in the Kennedys stemmed from Marilyn Monroe, and then I just became fascinated with the Kennedys' very entitled yet totally screwed up lives. I've watched and researched Ted Kennedy's Chappaquiddick disaster. I've read just a bit on John Jr. and why everyone thought he was the perfect man, even though he wasn't that nice all the time. I've begun reading more on Bobby Kennedy and have debated several times about picking up a book on Rosemary Kennedy, the missing daughter. When I bought Ask Not, I was most intrigued by Callahan putting all these women together into one book and their treatment by the Kennedys, not to mention her clever title, a reference to JFK's very famous inauguration speech. These are the books that inevitably I will end up reading, as I assume that the author has done an infinite amount of research and has put it all together in a good old-fashioned book. No AI or Googling used. I was not disappointed in the least in Callahan's book, and despite coming to the table with quite a bit of knowledge on the topic, I still learned a lot. So first off, Callahan starts her book off with a bang. Even before she writes anything, her dedication says, "For inconvenient women everywhere." And then you turn the page to find a quote from The Great Gatsby. And if you are familiar with The Great Gatsby, you can probably guess what quote that is. They were careless people. They smashed up things and creatures and then retreated back into their money or their vast carelessness or whatever it was that kept them together and let other people clean up the mess they had made. Wow. That's the perfect Kennedy quote. Even though it had nothing to do with the Kennedys. Because remember, F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote The Great Gatsby before the Kennedys took power in our collective history. I'm all in, which shows you the power of a quote before the book even begins. Callahan has chunked the book into categories where she then places 13 women with Kennedy connections. Some women, like Carolyn Bessette, Jackie, and Marilyn, have multiple chapters. Some only get one. Callahan has made these women the protagonists, yet writes with an omniscient point of view, taking into account the entitlement and arrogance of the Kennedy men. Many of these women are no longer alive, but I didn't find Callahan's narrative structure objectionable, primarily because Callahan refuses to do what so many other authors have done. They either paint the likes of Jackie and Marilyn as victims or villains. Callahan knows that neither is true. Humans, not just women, are complex individuals. She writes of Carolyn Bessette's cruelty to previous boyfriends, yet simultaneously shows John Jr.'s own cruelty. She shows us how the motivating factors and the enticement of being a Kennedy played a part in such women's decisions, and maybe many of us would have thought the same if we were in their shoes too. Many of the women in the book do make poor decisions, yet when we're talking about the abusive power structure and the time period of many of the happenings in the book, we cannot ignore the historical context. I enjoyed Callahan's ruthless writing at times, her objectivity to all people who appear in the book, men and women alike, yet her strong voice in taking to task the Kennedy family, who really did get away with murder more than once. Sure, she saves her harsh adjectives more for the Kennedy men than the women, but I'm perfectly okay with that. Let me read you a part in the book so you can see how Callahan writes. This passage is in regards to Jackie Kennedy, information she spoke to her doctor about, not a therapist, but a cardiologist. She called him on the phone and found someone she could confide in, and this is how Callahan writes of such an incident. Jackie would reach out to him, never the other way around. She didn't need a physician as much as a friend. She was too afraid to see a therapist. If word ever got out, people would think she was crazy. Would Dr. Finnerty help? "I know what's going on," she told him. "I'm not dumb or naive like people around my husband think. His infidelities don't bother me as much as that does." Sometimes Jackie could convince herself of this. It never lasted. "All these reporters, and they're almost always men, think I'm strange, that I must live off in my own world not to see what he's up to. I know exactly what he's up to." There were so many women that Jackie didn't know all of their names, or so she told the doctor. She was strong and prideful. She suspected that Lee had slept with her husband, just once, she was sure, but never said a thing. Lee was her sister, by the way. She knew about Jack and Pamela Turner, her own assistant. She knew about Jack's euphemistic pool parties held almost daily in the White House, often attended by his brothers Ted and Bobby and by Jack's various lackeys, and the two young White House secretaries who would also join them. Women ran up and down the back stairs whenever Jackie was away, leaving behind blonde hairs and bobby pins, dripping water, and passing their half-finished drinks to Secret Service agents as they scurried out the door, no doubt hearing that the First Lady was on her way home. There was the time Jackie found in her and Jack's White House bed a strange pair of underwear. "Would you please shop around and find who these belong to?" she had asked her husband. "They're not my size." She knew about his penchant for picking up girls while traveling and having 3-ways, 4-ways, 5-ways, swapping hookers with his buddies. She knew about the 15-year-old babysitter Jack had gotten pregnant back when he was a senator. The rumors were true. She had cut that deal with Joe then, the $1 million not to leave the marriage, millions more if Jack ever gave her a sexually transmitted disease again. Jackie really didn't think Jack loved any of these women. He treated them like the help. They came when he called, left when he told them to, and were led to expect nothing from him. But she was sick of keeping the problems in her marriage secret. "Jack needs to expel some kind of hormonal surge," she told Dr. Finnerty. "I don't think he even has affection for them. It's just this intrinsic part of his life, of vicious traits he inherited from his father." There was one woman, Jackie said, who did bother her, Marilyn Monroe. She didn't go into detail, but the doctor intuited that no other paramour made Jackie as insecure. He was right. Now, you might be asking how Callahan knows such things. She doesn't cite her information within the text. Sometimes she will reveal the main source of her info, but most of it is found at the back, in the notes, at the back of the book, which I did read because, yes, I'm that person. I was most curious about her sources on Jackie and Marilyn since I have read so much about them. Yes, you have to take certain sources with a grain of salt. For instance, I read Clint Hill's memoir about Jackie. Clint Hill was her Secret Service man. You probably know him as the guy who jumped on the car when JFK was assassinated and covered both Jackie and JFK. That's Clint Hill. Now, obviously, he's not going to reveal intimate details, and his memoir is going to be more guarded. On the flip side, a Marilyn Monroe biography by Anthony Summers, who found nothing wrong with printing Marilyn's morgue photograph in his book, is going to write more National Enquirer-like information. Callahan does a pretty good job at balancing all of this info, although I felt she didn't always address all the discrepancies, which maybe that just wouldn't have been possible. For instance, one book will say Marilyn only slept with JFK once, or that she never slept with Bobby at all, while other books will insist the opposite occurred. Since I'm talking about Marilyn here, here's a part where Callahan is describing what happens the day before Marilyn is found dead. And she writes, 6 weeks later, on August 4th, Bobby Kennedy was in California with his wife and children. He went straight to Marilyn's house. "Where is it?" he yelled at her. "Where the fuck is it?" He wanted her wiretap. He wanted her recordings of conversations with him and Jack. The FBI and the CIA, Bobby and Jack discovered, had bugged Marilyn's house and her phone line. It was a coordinated attempt to bring down both Kennedys. Didn't she get that? Marilyn had no idea what Bobby was talking about. Peter Lawford arrived and Bobby tried to play good cop. "We have to know," Bobby said. He was still yelling but trying now to bargain rather than bully. "It's important to the family. We can make any arrangements you want, but we must find it." "Calm down," Lawford told Bobby. Calm down. Something or someone got pushed into the wall or down to the floor. Then Bobby and Peter left. Hours later, at 7:30 that evening, Marilyn called Peter at home. He and Pat were throwing a party. Bobby would probably come, and they were all still expecting Marilyn too, but she would not be coming, now or ever. She had no last words for Bobby. "Say goodbye to Pat," Marilyn said to Peter. "Say goodbye to the president, and say goodbye to yourself, because you're a nice guy." Her body was found early the next morning in the pre-dawn dark by her housekeeper. She was face down on her bed, nude, with her phone still in her hand. She had been dead for hours. So here, Callahan has condensed a very complex situation, not to mention all the conspiracy theories regarding Marilyn's death. She uses a fact of the wiretap, other known facts like Marilyn's phone call to Peter Lawford, and condenses the timeline to Marilyn's reported death the next morning. powerful, and compelling. We'll never know the full story, plain and simple, so I enjoyed Callahan's narrative style and her narrative choices. She omits details, yet places other details just so perfectly. I think she did an excellent job with such a vast amount of information, yet managed to write an engaging book without confusing or overwhelming the reader. An interesting point that Callahan develops in her book throughout is the media's lack of use of the women's names. They are relegated to the blonde or even the girl. Many news outlets cover for the Kennedys, downgrading whatever tragedy has occurred using words like mishap or accident. When John Jr.'s plane crashed, even some media outlets kind of placed blame on Carolyn or questioned her involvement because she was a shrew-in for being late. Had she not been tardy or a bitch, that plane wouldn't have crashed. It's really a shame when you think about it, especially when we still have a tendency to do that today. So let me name each woman Callahan covers in her books. So Carolyn Bessette, who was John Jr.'s wife and probably should have trusted her gut during their on-again, off-again relationship prior to marrying him. Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy Onassis, but Callahan doesn't discuss much of her Bouvier days, but does show how Onassis didn't treat Jackie much better than Jack did. Jackie is used as sort of a phoenix in the book. Mary Richardson Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s wife who committed suicide. RFK Jr. drug her image through the mud after her death, ignoring the fact that she found his sex journal with all his affairs in it. Kit Kennedy, the renegade sister of JFK and Bobby, who died in a plane crash after her mother disowned her for marrying someone who was not Catholic. Mary Jo Kopechne, who Ted Kennedy killed when he refused to call the police after he drove his car off a bridge. She would have lived had Ted gotten help right away. As the autopsy revealed, she didn't drown, but suffocated. Ted got off with a slap on the wrist, of course. Joan Bennett Kennedy, Ted's first wife during Chappaquiddick, and actually was the strongest member of his campaign as she stood by him through all that chaos, who Ted dumps immediately after withdrawing from the race. Pamela Kelly, who was paralyzed after Bobby Kennedy's son drove recklessly, who was fined a whopping $100. Martha Moxley, who was murdered by Michael Skakel, a Kennedy cousin, but he is now a free man. Of course he is. Then we have Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy, the matriarch of the original Kennedy family, the mom of JFK and Bobby. She gets a brief chapter, but she could have actually gotten more and even more developed about her, considering how awful her husband Joe was and how much JFK loathed his mother for abandoning him in childhood. And then there's Rosemary Kennedy, whose delayed birth may have caused some developmental disabilities, who then her father, Joe Kennedy, took her to get a lobotomy, which led her to being unable to speak or care for herself. None of the Kennedys even knew where she was. No one even asked any questions. Good grief. And of course, you know Marilyn Monroe. If you believe Joe DiMaggio, the Kennedys killed her. And then there's Mimi Beardsley and Diana DeVay, two young women who worked for Kennedy. Mimi was more or less prostituted out for JFK's pleasure, while Diana's affair with JFK began before he was president and continued for 4 years. Yeah, you can't make that stuff up. Here's a part of Mimi's story, which is really insightful as she describes her experience with JFK. So things were moving fast now that JFK was in the swing of things at the White House, and Mimi was struggling to make sense of it all. There were the invitations to travel when the president did, increasingly with a degree of separateness. Mimi was finding herself on a downward trajectory, stashed in cheap motel rooms and told never to leave, not for anything, until she was summoned to the president's 5-star hotel or family estate. She called it the waiting game. Mimi could feel the disdain among the president's closest aides, but she didn't care. She was more worried about pleasing the most powerful man in the world and keeping her friends and family and the American public from learning about their relationship. It never occurred to her to ask herself, why was she the target of other staffers' contempt? Why didn't they blame the president, whose newborn son Patrick had lived less than 2 days? Why didn't they give him hell for traveling around with a teenage intern when he should have been at home comforting Jackie? It was all too confusing for Mimi, who felt that the president had come to rely on her emotionally. After Patrick died, while Jackie was still in the hospital recovering from an emergency C-section and double-unit blood transfusion and the trauma of never having held her baby, he invited Mimi up to the private residence and onto the portico, where he read condolence letters aloud and cried. This may have been the most profound violation of his marriage to Jackie, but Mimi couldn't see it as anything but confirmation of her importance to the president. It was she to whom he had turned for comfort, she whom he trusted with his tears. What was this, if not intimacy? The president never even used protection with Mimi. Was this part of his recklessness, or was this his way of tempting fate? He was the most famous Catholic in the world. If Mimi got pregnant with their child, well, he must have considered that possibility, right? He would have to take care of them. Maybe he would leave Jackie someday, maybe not, but whatever happened with his marriage, getting Mimi pregnant would mean that she would always be in his life. Was that what he wanted? And it's really sad when you think about it. And I can't help think of Monica Lewinsky with this abuse of power, who was ripped in the media while Bill Clinton's popularity soared after we knew of the affair with Monica Lewinsky. So have times really changed? Well, I don't know. Maybe not. Here's what Callahan has written in the epilogue, and it's just really something to think about. We are making progress, especially in understanding that there is no perfect female victim, but we may have miles to go. When a life-size bronze statue of JFK was unveiled in D.C. in 2021, not one bit of news coverage addressed his treatment of women. Not one journalist, essayist, political writer, or cultural critic asked whether this was a man deserving in our new era of such a memorial. Not one asked what kind of message his continued celebration sends to women and girls now and in the future. Ask not, indeed. Just think about that. We are tearing down statues and renaming libraries and such because somebody owned slaves or did something of equal atrociousness. Yet we continue to honor JFK. Food for thought. I have just scratched the surface of Callahan's book, and she too just scratched the surface. Many of these women have had multiple books written about them or have been mentioned in multiple books. What Callahan has done successfully in Ask Not is give them a voice, a name, and has shown the perspective from all sides, not a glossy media coverage of another Kennedy oops. I have little criticism of the book, only that I found keeping the Kennedy family straight impossible thanks to all the juniors, but Callahan does provide a nifty family tree at the back of the book, which I found useful many times. If you know a lot about the Kennedys and some of these women, you must read Ask Not. If you are interested in reading about how women are treated in the media when they are related to or have connections to powerful men, you must read Ask Not. If you are interested in history and the personal lives of powerful men and how they frequently abuse their power, you need to read Ask Not. If you are curious about the lives of the Kennedys or Jackie or Marilyn and have not yet read much about them, Ask Not is an excellent place to start. It will blow your mind. Ask Not is an eye-opening book, one that will make you think about our past, our present, and certainly our future. As Callahan states in her intro, ask not, let's. Thanks for watching. As always, my goal at Booksmart is to get a little bit smarter, one book at a time.